Hey guys, tonight we're settling in for a nice, relaxing journey through the absolute mess that is American presidential sexual history. So go ahead and get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab a warm beverage, because we're about to spend the next hour and a half talking about which founding fathers couldn't keep it in their britches, which presidents had secret children scattered across the country, and which ones turned the White House into basically a frat house. Before we dive in, if you enjoy falling asleep to the sound of historical dysfunction, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel, and you'll get more content like this to drift off to. Now, when we think about presidential scandals, we usually think about modern stuff. Clinton and Lewinsky, that whole thing. But here's what's wild. American presidents have been absolute disasters in their personal lives since literally the beginning. The founding fathers were out here having affairs, fathering secret children, engaging in deeply questionable relationships, and then we just put their faces on money and called it a day. So tonight we're going to walk through some of the most notable presidential affairs and illegitimate children in American history, and we're going to do it in a calm, soothing voice because chaos is more relaxing when it happened 200 years ago. Let's start at the beginning because of course we have to talk about Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson is one of those founding fathers who gets mythologized beyond recognition. Author of the Declaration of Independence, third president, Renaissance man, architect, inventor, philosopher, guy on the nickel, and also guy who almost certainly had a decades-long sexual relationship with an enslaved woman who was his property, which is about as ethically horrifying as it gets. So here's the background. Thomas Jefferson married Martha Wales Skelton in 1772. She was a young widow, well-educated, played the harpsichord, came from a wealthy Virginia family. By all accounts, they were genuinely in love, which is nice. They had 6 children together, though only 2 survived to adulthood, because this is the 18th century and childhood mortality was just a constant nightmare that everyone lived with. Martha died in 1782, just 10 years into their marriage. She was 33 years old. Jefferson was absolutely devastated. He allegedly promised her on her deathbed that he would never remarry, which he never did. Very romantic, very devoted. He spent weeks shut in his room, refusing to see anyone, wandering the grounds of Monticello in a grief-stricken daze. His daughter later described him as almost insane with grief. But here's where things get complicated. Among the enslaved people that Martha Jefferson inherited from her father was a young woman named Sally Hemings. And Sally Hemings was actually Martha's half-sister, because Martha's father, John Wales, had enslaved Sally's mother and had a sexual relationship with her that produced several children, including Sally. So Sally and Martha were related, but one was born free and wealthy, and the other was born enslaved. Just absolutely the grim reality of slavery right there. After Martha died, Jefferson eventually went to France as the American minister. This was in 1784, and in 1787, he had his youngest daughter, 9-year-old Polly, brought over to join him. Polly was accompanied by a 14-year-old enslaved girl as her chaperone and caretaker. That girl was Sally Hemings, 14 years old, traveling across the Atlantic to France. Now, here's the thing about France. Slavery was illegal there. Sally Hemings could have claimed her freedom. She could have just walked away. But she was 14, alone in a foreign country, didn't speak French, and was completely dependent on the Jeffersons. So she stayed. At some point during their time in France, Thomas Jefferson, who was in his mid-40s, began a sexual relationship with Sally Hemings, who was maybe 15 or 16 when it started. Let's be absolutely clear about what this was. This was not a romance. This was not a consensual relationship between equals. She was enslaved. He owned her. She was a teenager. He was a middle-aged man with complete power over her entire life. There is no universe in which this is anything other than sexual abuse. But Jefferson's defenders have spent literal centuries trying to frame this as some kind of love story, which is a choice. The relationship continued when they returned to Virginia. Sally Hemings lived at Monticello for the rest of her life, and over the years she had 6 children. The historical and DNA evidence strongly suggests that Thomas Jefferson fathered all or most of them. The first public accusation came in 1802, when a journalist named James Callender who had a personal grudge against Jefferson, published articles claiming that Jefferson had a slave concubine named Sally and had fathered multiple children with her. He even named one of the children, Tom, who everyone apparently agreed looked remarkably like Jefferson. Just absolutely resembled him. Jefferson never publicly responded to these accusations. He just ignored them completely. And for the most part, white society was happy to dismiss the whole thing as political slander. Because of course they were. But the story persisted, especially among Sally Hemings' descendants, who maintained their family history for generations. It wasn't until 1998 that DNA testing was done on descendants of both Jefferson and Sally Hemings. The results showed a genetic match, strongly supporting the conclusion that Jefferson fathered at least one of her children, and probably all of them. Most historians now accept this as historical fact, though there are still holdouts who desperately want to believe it's not true, which tells you something about how uncomfortable this makes people. Sally Hemings' children were eventually freed. Some of them were allowed to leave Monticello when they turned 21. Jefferson's will freed Sally's two youngest sons. Sally herself was never formally freed, but she was allowed to live freely after Jefferson's death. She lived with her sons in Charlottesville until she died in 1835. So that's the Thomas Jefferson situation. Founding father, author of All Men Are Created Equal, enslaved his own children, had a sexual relationship with a teenager he owned, and we put his face on Mount Rushmore. Just to really drive home the cognitive dissonance of American history, let's move forward a bit to another presidential scandal, this one involving Alexander Hamilton, who wasn't president but was definitely important enough to talk about. Hamilton is having a major cultural moment thanks to the musical, so everyone knows he was this brilliant, ambitious founding father who helped create the American financial system. He was also Washington's aide during the Revolutionary War, first Secretary of the Treasury, wrote a bunch of the Federalist Papers, got in constant fights with Thomas Jefferson and basically everyone else. Guy could not stop making enemies. Hamilton married Elizabeth Schuyler in 1780. She was from a wealthy, prominent New York family. The marriage seems to have been genuinely loving, and they had 8 children together. But in 1791, while Hamilton was serving as Treasury Secretary, he began an affair with a woman named Maria Reynolds. Maria Reynolds was 23 years old when she showed up at Hamilton's house in Philadelphia claiming that her husband had abandoned her and she needed help. Hamilton, who was 34 at the time, apparently decided the best way to help was to start sleeping with her. Because of course he did. The affair continued for about a year. Plot twist. Maria Reynolds' husband, James Reynolds, hadn't actually abandoned her. He knew about the affair the whole time, and he decided to use this knowledge to extort money from Hamilton. He started blackmailing him, demanding payments to keep quiet about the affair, and Hamilton, trapped, paid him multiple times, hundreds of dollars, which was a lot of money in the 1790s. Eventually, James Reynolds got arrested for an unrelated financial scheme, and while in jail, he started making noises about having damaging information about Alexander Hamilton. This caught the attention of several of Hamilton's political enemies, who assumed the damaging information was about financial corruption, because Hamilton was Treasury Secretary, right? So they thought he was involved in some kind of embezzlement or fraud scheme. Hamilton met with these men and basically said, "No, I wasn't stealing public money. I was just having an affair and getting blackmailed about it." And he showed them all the letters and receipts to prove it. The men agreed to keep it quiet because this was personal scandal, not public corruption. But one of them didn't keep it quiet. Years later, in 1797, the information was published in a pamphlet by journalist James Callender. Yes, the same James Callender who later exposed the Sally Hemings story. This guy made a career out of presidential sex scandals. And here's where Hamilton made a fascinating choice. Instead of denying it or ignoring it, he published his own pamphlet admitting to the entire affair in excruciating detail. The Reynolds pamphlet, it's called. 95 pages of Alexander Hamilton explaining exactly how and when he had sex with Maria Reynolds, how the blackmail worked, defending his public financial integrity while completely destroying his personal reputation. His wife, Eliza, was humiliated. She burned all the letters Hamilton had written to her, which is why we don't have much record of their personal correspondence. She eventually forgave him, apparently, and stayed married to him until he died in that famous duel with Aaron Burr in 1804. She lived for another 50 years after his death, spending much of that time working to preserve his legacy and establish his historical reputation. She also pointedly did not include the Reynolds affair in any of the biographical material she helped compile. Just completely left it out. Can't blame her. Now, let's drift over to Andrew Jackson, 7th president, famous for being absolutely unhinged in basically every aspect of his life. Jackson is one of those presidents who you learn about in school as this rough frontier hero, founder of the Democratic Party, champion of the common man. What they often don't mention is that he was also violent, temperamental, owned enslaved people, and his marriage was Andrew Jackson's marital mess and other early presidential disasters. So, Andrew Jackson. Let's talk about his marriage situation, which was a scandal that followed him his entire political career and probably contributed to one of the stranger tragedies in early American history. Jackson married Rachel Donaldson Robards in 1791, or at least he thought he married her. Rachel had been previously married to a man named Louis Robards, and the marriage was apparently miserable. Robards was jealous, abusive, controlling. Rachel left him and went back to her family. Robards filed for divorce, or at least started the process, and everyone involved believed the divorce had gone through. So Andrew Jackson, who had met Rachel and fallen for her, married her in 1791. They had a ceremony. They considered themselves husband and wife. They lived together as a married couple. Everything seemed fine, except the divorce hadn't actually been finalized. Louis Robards had filed for permission to divorce Rachel, but he hadn't completed the actual legal process, which meant that when Rachel married Andrew Jackson, she was technically still married to Louis Robards, which meant Rachel and Andrew were living in what was legally adultery. When they discovered this error a few years later, they were horrified. They immediately had another marriage ceremony in 1794, once Rachel's divorce was properly finalized. But the damage was done. For the rest of their lives, Jackson's political enemies used this against him. They called Rachel a bigamist and an adulteress. They called Jackson a wife-stealer who had run off with another man's wife. They published pamphlets and newspaper articles dragging Rachel's reputation through the mud. Jackson, who had a legendary temper and had already killed one man in a duel, was absolutely furious about these attacks. He got into multiple duels and fights defending Rachel's honor. He carried a bullet in his chest for decades from one of these duels. He was ready to kill anyone who insulted his wife, and he nearly did on several occasions. When Jackson ran for president in 1828, the attacks on Rachel intensified. His opponents really went after her, calling her every terrible name you can imagine. The campaign was vicious. Jackson won the election, but Rachel didn't live to see him inaugurated. She died suddenly in December 1828, just a few weeks after the election. She was 61 years old, and she'd been in declining health, but Jackson always believed that the stress and pain of the campaign attacks had killed her. He never remarried. He kept her portrait in his room at the White House. He visited her grave regularly, and he blamed his political enemies for her death for the rest of his life. So that's Andrew Jackson's marriage scandal, a technical legal error that turned into a decades-long source of pain and public humiliation, ending in what Jackson saw as the murder of his wife by political slander. Now, while we're in the early 1800s, we should probably mention that most of the early presidents were remarkably boring in their personal lives, at least publicly. John Adams was devoted to Abigail and never had any hint of scandal. James Madison seems to have been faithful to Dolly. James Monroe was scandal-free. John Quincy Adams was as stiff and proper as you'd expect from John Adams' son. But then we get to the later 19th century, and things get interesting again. Let's talk about Grover Cleveland, because Cleveland has one of the wildest presidential scandals in American history, and it involves an illegitimate child, a possible assault, and a political campaign that somehow succeeded despite everyone knowing about it. Grover Cleveland was a bachelor when he ran for president in 1884. He was the governor of New York, had a reputation for honesty and reform, and was running against James Blaine. During the campaign, a Buffalo newspaper published a story claiming that Cleveland had fathered an illegitimate child with a woman named Maria Halpin. Here's what apparently happened. Cleveland had a relationship with Maria Halpin, a widow who worked in a department store sometime around 1874. Maria Halpin also had relationships with several other men around the same time. In 1874, she gave birth to a son and named him Oscar Folsom Cleveland. She claimed Grover Cleveland was the father. Cleveland accepted responsibility for the child and paid child support, though he apparently never acknowledged the child publicly as his son. But the story gets darker. Maria Halpin later claimed that Cleveland had sexually assaulted her and that the child was conceived through rape. Cleveland's version of events, relayed through intermediaries, was that the relationship was consensual. We'll never know the truth with certainty, but what happened next is pretty horrifying regardless. Maria Halpin struggled with alcoholism and was apparently not coping well with single motherhood. Cleveland and his friends arranged to have her committed to a mental asylum briefly, and they placed the child in an orphanage. Eventually, the child was adopted by a family friend of Cleveland's. Maria Halpin got out of the asylum and tried to get her child back, but Cleveland's friends prevented it. She eventually gave up and left Buffalo. So when this story came out during the 1884 campaign, Cleveland's opponents had a field day. Ma, where's my pa? Became the taunt from Republicans. They published cartoons showing Cleveland as a deadbeat dad. They spread the story everywhere. It should have destroyed his campaign. But Cleveland did something unusual. He told his campaign staff to tell the truth, or at least his version of the truth. He admitted he had supported the child financially. He presented himself as having done the honorable thing by taking responsibility, even though he wasn't certain he was the father. Remember, Maria Halpin had been involved with other men too. Cleveland's supporters came up with their own chant in response. Gone to the White House? Ha ha ha! As in, Ma's asking where Pa is and he's gone to the White House. Which is pretty dark humor, but it apparently worked. Cleveland won the election and became the only bachelor to be elected president. He remained unmarried during his first year in office. And then, in 1886, Cleveland married Frances Folsom, who was 21 years old. Cleveland was 49. Frances was the daughter of Cleveland's former law partner, Oscar Folsom, who had died years earlier. Cleveland had known Frances since she was born. He had been her legal guardian after her father died. And then he married her. She was young enough to be his daughter. She was literally the daughter of his dead friend, whom he had helped raise. The age gap was 27 years. The press went absolutely wild for this wedding. It was the first and only wedding of a president in the White House itself. Frances became the youngest First Lady in American history. And despite the creepy circumstances, seriously, your former legal guardian who's almost 30 years older than you, the marriage seems to have been happy. They had 5 children together. Frances was reportedly devoted to Cleveland, and he adored her. Cleveland lost his re-election bid in 1888, but won again in 1892, becoming the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. Frances told the White House staff when they left in 1889 to keep everything in good order because they'd be back, which is a pretty confident prediction that turned out to be right. But back to that illegitimate son. Cleveland never publicly acknowledged him. The boy, who was renamed after being adopted, grew up not knowing that the President of the United States was allegedly his biological father. He became a doctor and lived a normal life. The scandal faded into history, though it's never been completely forgotten. Now let's float over to Warren G. Harding, because if we're talking about presidential affairs, we absolutely have to discuss Harding. Harding was president from 1921 to 1923, and he might be the most unfaithful president in American history. This man had affairs like some people collect stamps. Multiple affairs. Overlapping affairs. Affairs with his wife's friend. Affairs in the White House. Just absolutely could not help himself. Harding was a newspaper publisher from Ohio, married to Florence Kling, who was 5 years older than him and significantly more ambitious and intelligent. Florence basically managed his political career. She was called the Duchess, and she ran a tight ship. But their marriage was apparently not great. They stayed together for political and social reasons more than love. Harding's most significant affair was with Carrie Fulton Phillips, the wife of his friend James Phillips. This affair started around 1905 and continued for about 15 years. Carrie and Warren would meet secretly, write passionate letters to each other, and generally carry on this long-term relationship while both of them remained married to other people. The letters they exchanged are absolutely wild. We know this because they survived and were eventually opened to researchers in 2014. Harding wrote things like calling his penis Jerry in the letters. Just absolutely unhinged romantic correspondence. He was completely obsessed with Carrie Phillips. But here's where it gets complicated. Carrie Phillips was pro-German during World War I, and Harding was a U.S. senator who supported the war effort. They had political disagreements that strained the relationship. Also, Carrie's husband eventually found out about the affair, and while he apparently tolerated it for a while, the situation became increasingly messy. When Harding was preparing to run for president in 1920, the Republican Party found out about this affair and panicked. They were terrified it would destroy his campaign, so they essentially bribed Carrie Phillips and her husband to take a trip to Japan and stay quiet, gave them thousands of dollars and a monthly stipend, literally paid them to leave the country during the election. It worked. The affair stayed quiet, and Harding won. But Harding wasn't done having affairs. While he was a senator, he started another affair with a woman named Nan Britton, who was 30 years younger than him. She was literally a teenager when they met. She had a crush on him when she was in high school and he was already in his 50s. At some point after she was an adult, they began a sexual relationship that continued during his presidency. According to Nan Britton's later account, she and Harding would meet in a coat closet in the White House for sex. Coat closet. The President of the United States, sneaking off to have sex in a closet like a teenager because his wife might catch him. Just absolutely undignified behavior. Nan Britton claimed she became pregnant and gave birth to Harding's daughter in 1919. She named the child Elizabeth, and Harding allegedly supported the child financially through intermediaries, sending money regularly, but never publicly acknowledged her. He couldn't, obviously, without destroying his career and marriage. Harding died suddenly in 1923, while still in office. He was only 57. The cause of death was likely a heart attack or stroke, though there was speculation at the time about everything from poisoning to suicide. His wife Florence burned many of his personal papers after his death, which has led to endless speculation about what she was trying to hide. After Harding died, Nan Britton wrote a book called The President's Daughter in 1927, detailing her affair with Harding and claiming he had fathered her child. The book was scandalous and became a bestseller. The Harding family denied everything. They refused to acknowledge Elizabeth and as Harding's daughter. This went on for decades. Elizabeth and Bleasing, as she was later known, maintained her entire life that Warren Harding was her father. The Harding family maintained she wasn't. It wasn't until 2015, almost 100 years after her birth, that DNA testing finally proved that Elizabeth Ann was indeed Harding's biological daughter. The genetic evidence was conclusive. So Warren Harding fathered an illegitimate child with a woman 30 years younger than him, met her in White House closets for sex, died suddenly possibly from the stress of his increasingly scandal-plagued presidency, and his family denied his daughter's existence for 90 years until science finally proved it. That's quite a legacy. FDR's complex love life and the war years. Now let's drift into the 20th century a bit more and talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because FDR had one of the most complicated personal lives of any president, and it was all happening while he was leading the country through the Great Depression and World War II. So you've got this man who's literally saving democracy and also juggling multiple romantic relationships while his wife is off doing her own thing. It's a mess, but like a very competent mess. FDR married Eleanor Roosevelt in 1905. They were actually fifth cousins, which was apparently fine in early 20th century New York society. Eleanor was Theodore Roosevelt's niece, and Theodore gave her away at the wedding because her father had died. So FDR married his distant cousin with the sitting president as the bride's escort. Just very on-brand for the Roosevelt family. Eleanor and Franklin had 6 children together between 1906 and 1916. By all accounts, the early years of their marriage were reasonably happy, or at least functional. Eleanor was shy and serious. Franklin was charming and social. They were a political power couple, with Franklin rising through Democratic Party ranks and Eleanor gradually becoming more involved in social causes. But in 1918, everything fell apart. Eleanor discovered love letters between Franklin and her social secretary, Lucy Mercer. Franklin had been having an affair with Lucy, and it had apparently been going on for several years. Eleanor was devastated. She offered Franklin a divorce. Now here's the thing. Divorce in 1918 for a prominent political figure was career suicide. Franklin's mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who was controlling and wealthy and held the purse strings, threatened to cut him off entirely if he divorced Eleanor. And Franklin's political advisor, Lewis Howe, told him that a divorce would end his political career permanently. Catholics wouldn't vote for a divorced man. Many Protestants wouldn't either. He'd be done. So Franklin chose his career over Lucy Mercer. He ended the affair, or at least claimed to. He promised Eleanor he would never see Lucy again. Eleanor stayed in the marriage, but things were never the same. Their relationship became more of a political partnership than a romantic marriage. They maintained separate lives in many ways. Eleanor had her own friends, her own causes, her own living spaces. Franklin had his. Eleanor threw herself into activism and political work. She became a champion of civil rights, women's rights, labor rights. She was arguably more progressive than Franklin on many issues. She gave lectures, wrote a newspaper column, traveled constantly. She became one of the most influential first ladies in American history, not because of her husband, but because of her own work and convictions. And Eleanor also had her own very close relationships. There's been extensive historical debate about whether Eleanor was bisexual or lesbian and whether she had romantic relationships with women. She had extremely close friendships with several women, particularly Lorena Hickok, a journalist. The letters between Eleanor and Lorena are intensely affectionate and intimate. Whether these relationships were romantic or sexual is something historians argue about, but they were definitely deeply important emotional bonds. Meanwhile, Franklin continued to have his own relationships. Despite his promise to Eleanor, he apparently reconnected with Lucy Mercer, who had married someone else in the meantime. They maintained some kind of relationship, seeing each other occasionally, corresponding. And Lucy Mercer was actually with Franklin when he died in 1945. She was at Warm Springs, Georgia, sitting for a portrait with him when he had the cerebral hemorrhage that killed him. Eleanor wasn't there. She didn't even know Lucy was there until after Franklin's death. You can imagine how that felt, finding out that your husband's former mistress had been with him when he died. But we should also talk about Missy Luhand, because she's a crucial part of this story. Marguerite Missy Luhand was FDR's personal secretary starting in 1920, and she became absolutely central to his life. She lived in the White House. She managed his schedule. She was with him constantly, and many historians believe she was essentially his companion and possibly lover for over 20 years. Missy was completely devoted to FDR. She worked incredibly long hours. She knew his preferences, his moods, his needs. She was the person he relaxed with in the evenings. She mixed his cocktails, joined him for dinner, watched movies with him. Eleanor was often away traveling, and Missy was there. The exact nature of their relationship is debated, but several of FDR's children later suggested that Missy was essentially their father's partner in everything but name. FDR's son Elliot wrote in his memoir that he believed his father and Missy were in love. FDR's son James said he was certain they had a romantic relationship. Whether it was sexual is unclear, especially given FDR's paralysis from polio, but it was certainly intimate and emotionally significant. Missy Luhand had a stroke in 1941 and was never the same. She died in 1944, a year before FDR did. FDR was reportedly heartbroken. He had been planning to leave Missy half of his estate, though his will was changed before his death, and she ended up with much less. So you've got FDR, this transformational president who led America through its darkest hours, and his personal life is this complex web of his estranged wife who's doing her own incredible work, his former mistress who shows up when he's dying, his devoted secretary who may have been the love of his life, and probably other relationships we don't even know about. And all of this is happening while he's dealing with the Depression and then World War II. The man compartmentalized like a champion. Eleanor found out about Lucy Mercer being there when Franklin died, and she was hurt and angry, but she also continued with her life and her work. She became the U.S. delegate to the United Nations. She helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She remained politically active and influential until her death in 1962. She's remembered as one of the most important women in American history, and she built that legacy despite, or maybe partly because of, her difficult marriage. Now, let's skip forward a bit and talk about Dwight D. Eisenhower, because even Ike, everyone's favorite grandfatherly president, had his romantic complications. Eisenhower was married to Mamie Dowd, and they stayed married for 53 years until his death. But during World War II, while Eisenhower was serving as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, he had a very close relationship with his driver and secretary, Kay Summersby. Kay Summersby was a British woman who had been assigned as Eisenhower's driver in London. She was smart, capable, and apparently quite charming. She and Eisenhower spent a lot of time together during the war years. She was with him constantly, traveling with him, managing his schedule, providing companionship during incredibly stressful times. The question of whether they had an affair has been debated for decades. Kay Summersby wrote a memoir after Eisenhower's death claiming that they had been in love and had planned to marry after the war, but that the affair was never consummated because Eisenhower was impotent. This was explosive stuff, but impossible to verify since Eisenhower was dead and couldn't respond. What we know for certain is that they were close. Eisenhower wrote to Mamie less frequently during the war, and when he did write, the letters were often brief and businesslike. He spent his leisure time with Kay. They went horseback riding together. They dined together. They were photographed together often enough that rumors were circulating during the war. Some historians believe it was a full affair. Others think it was an emotional affair that never became physical. Others think it was just a close working relationship that got misinterpreted. Eisenhower's son John insisted that his father would never have had an affair. But then, that's what children always want to believe. After the war, Eisenhower returned to the United States and resumed his life with Mamie. Kay Summersby stayed in Europe and eventually moved to New York. She and Eisenhower apparently saw each other once or twice after the war, but then contact ended. When Eisenhower ran for president, his advisors were very concerned about the Kay Summersby rumors, but nothing concrete ever came out during the campaigns. Kay eventually married and then divorced. She was diagnosed with cancer in the 1970s and wrote her memoir partly to make money for medical bills. After it was published, the Eisenhower family and many of Eisenhower's associates vehemently denied her claims. They said she was lying, that she'd fabricated the romance for money. But several people who had been with Eisenhower during the war came forward to say that they'd witnessed the relationship and believed Kay's account. We'll never know exactly what happened between them, but it's pretty clear that during the most consequential period of his life, leading the Allied forces to victory in World War II, Eisenhower had some kind of significant emotional connection with a woman who wasn't his wife. And he went back to Mamie and stayed married to her for the rest of his life, and they seemed content enough. Just another complicated presidential marriage. Now we need to talk about Lyndon Johnson, because Johnson was absolutely notorious for his affairs and his generally inappropriate behavior. LBJ was crude, aggressive, and had no sense of personal boundaries. He would conduct meetings while sitting on the toilet. He would show people his surgical scars uninvited. He grabbed people, invaded their personal space, and generally acted like someone who had never learned basic social skills. He was married to Lady Bird Johnson, who was by all accounts patient, dignified, and much classier than her husband deserved. She managed his political career, raised their daughters, and tolerated his constant infidelity with remarkable grace. Johnson had affairs throughout his marriage. Multiple affairs. Affairs with secretaries, affairs with journalists, affairs with whoever was available and willing. He wasn't particularly discreet about it either. People knew. Lady Bird knew. But this was the 1950s and 60s, and political wives were expected to smile and pretend everything was fine. One of Johnson's longer affairs was with Alice Glass, a woman he'd been involved with since the 1930s, before he became president. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and politically engaged. Johnson was apparently genuinely in love with her, or as much as someone like Johnson could be in love with anyone besides himself. The affair continued on and off for years, even after she married someone else. He also had an affair with Madeline Brown, who claimed that Johnson fathered her son, Stephen, born in 1950. She said Johnson supported the child financially but never publicly acknowledged him. This was another one of those situations where someone claimed to have a presidential love child, the family denied it, and there was no way to prove it one way or another until DNA testing became available. In this case, testing was reportedly done in the 1990s with inconclusive results, so Stephen Brown's paternity remains disputed. But beyond specific affairs, Johnson was just generally inappropriate with women. He made sexual comments, made advances, acted like he was entitled to any woman's attention or body. This was the kind of thing that was tolerated at the time, especially from powerful men, but would absolutely get you fired and possibly prosecuted today. He was, by modern standards, a serial sexual harasser at minimum. Lady Bird Johnson stayed with him through all of this. She was instrumental in his political success. She ran his congressional office when he was serving in the Navy during World War II. She supported his Senate career. She was a major asset during his presidency, particularly with her work on beautifying America and environmental conservation. And she put up with his affairs and his generally awful behavior, because that's what political wives of her generation did. Kennedy's White House circus and the myth of Camelot. And now we arrive at John F. Kennedy, who might actually be the most unfaithful president in American history, which is saying something given the competition. JFK turned the White House into basically his personal playground, and the sheer number and variety of his affairs is almost impressive in how reckless it was. This man was the president during the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the height of the Cold War, and he was also sneaking women into the White House pool for afternoon trysts. Priorities, apparently. Let's start with the marriage, because understanding Jackie Kennedy is important to understanding the whole situation. JFK married Jacqueline Bouvier in 1953. She was beautiful, sophisticated, cultured, spoke multiple languages, had studied art and literature in Europe. She was exactly the kind of wife that would be an asset to an ambitious politician. The wedding was huge, lavish, attended by over 800 guests. It looked perfect from the outside. But Jack Kennedy had been a womanizer his entire adult life, and marriage didn't slow him down at all. He'd grown up watching his father, Joseph Kennedy, have affairs constantly while his mother Rose pretended not to notice. That was the model of marriage Jack had. Infidelity was just what Kennedy men did, apparently. It was practically a family tradition. Jackie knew about the affairs. Of course she knew. Everyone in their social circle knew. But she stayed, partly because divorce was unthinkable for a Catholic couple with political ambitions, and partly because she'd made her choice and she was going to maintain her dignity regardless of what her husband did. Now, once JFK became president in 1961, the affairs continued, but with the added complication that he was now the most visible person in America. The Secret Service knew about the affairs because they had to facilitate them. The White House staff knew. The press knew, or at least suspected, but they didn't report it because there was still some sense of privacy around presidents' personal lives back then. Journalists knew things but didn't publish them. Can you imagine that happening today? The man would be destroyed in about 15 minutes on social media. One of JFK's most notable affairs was with Marilyn Monroe, though that's probably the most famous one rather than the most significant one. Monroe was already a massive star when she got involved with Kennedy, probably in 1962. They'd known each other socially for years, but the affair apparently became physical sometime after he became president. The details are murky because both of them are dead and the people who knew things aren't talking, but Marilyn Monroe definitely sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" to JFK at Madison Square Garden in May 1962, in that absolutely iconic breathless voice, wearing that incredibly tight flesh-colored dress. Jackie Kennedy didn't attend that event, which was probably wise given that Marilyn might as well have been singing "I'm Sleeping with Your Husband," given how sexual the performance was. The affair apparently ended not long after that, possibly because it was becoming too public and too risky, or possibly because Bobby Kennedy, JFK's brother and Attorney General, convinced Monroe to end it. There are endless conspiracy theories about Monroe's death in August 1962, including theories that she was killed because she knew too much about the Kennedys, but the most likely explanation is that she died of an overdose. Whether accidental or intentional, we'll never know for certain. But Marilyn Monroe was just one of many, many women JFK was involved with. There was Judith Campbell Exner, who was simultaneously having affairs with JFK and with Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana. Yes, the president was sleeping with a woman who was also sleeping with a mafia boss. The national security implications of this are absolutely wild. Exner claimed she carried messages between JFK and Giancana, which if true means the president was using his mistress as a go-between with organized crime. Just absolutely reckless behavior. The FBI found out about this connection and told JFK he needed to end contact with Exner. He apparently did, or at least reduced contact significantly. But the fact that it happened at all, that the President of the United States was involved with someone who had direct connections to the mafia during a time when his brother Bobby was aggressively prosecuting organized crime, just shows how little Kennedy thought about consequences when it came to his personal life. Then there were the White House staffers. There were two young women, Priscilla Ware and Jill Cowan, who were nicknamed Fiddle and Faddle by the Secret Service. They were in their early 20s, worked in the White House press office, and apparently spent a lot of time with JFK in private. They'd swim with him in the pool, join him for parties, and the Secret Service agents would discreetly look the other way. There was Mimi Alford, who was a 19-year-old White House intern when she began a relationship with JFK that she later described as an affair, though given the enormous power imbalance. She was a teenager and he was the President of the United States. It's more accurately described as exploitation. She kept silent about it for decades, only publishing her account in 2012, long after everyone involved was dead. In her memoir, Alford described how JFK initiated the relationship just 4 days into her internship, how she felt she couldn't say no, how the affair continued for about 18 months. She described specific incidents, including one where JFK allegedly pressured her to perform oral sex on one of his aides while he watched. Just absolutely predatory behavior that he apparently felt entitled to because he was powerful and handsome and no one had ever told him no. There was Mary Pinchot Meyer, who was an artist and socialite and the ex-wife of a CIA official. She and JFK had an affair that lasted from 1962 until his death in 1963. This one might have been more emotionally significant than most of his other affairs. They apparently talked about art and politics. She shared his interest in exploring consciousness, and there are claims that they experimented with LSD together in the White House, which may or may not be true but is certainly consistent with the 1960s. Mary Pinchot Meyer was murdered in 1964, shot while walking along a canal in Georgetown. The case was never solved. A man was arrested and tried but acquitted. There have been conspiracy theories ever since about whether she was killed because of her relationship with JFK or because of things she knew. Most likely she was the victim of a random attack or someone she knew killed her for reasons unrelated to the Kennedys. But the mysterious circumstances have fueled speculation for decades. And there were more, so many more. An actress here, a socialite there, random women he met at parties. JFK was compulsive about it. Some historians have suggested he was a sex addict, that he literally couldn't control his behavior. Others suggest it was about power, about asserting dominance, about proving his masculinity. He'd had serious health problems his whole life, Addison's disease, chronic back pain, various other ailments, and maybe the affairs were his way of feeling vital and alive. Whatever the psychological motivation, the practical reality was that the President of the United States was constantly distracted by his affairs, constantly taking risks that could have been exploited by enemies foreign or domestic, and creating situations where he could have been blackmailed or compromised. The fact that nothing catastrophic came of this is honestly more luck than judgment. Jackie Kennedy dealt with all of this by maintaining an almost superhuman level of grace and composure in public. She became an icon of style and elegance. She renovated the White House and gave a televised tour that was watched by millions. She promoted arts and culture. She was the perfect first lady, at least in public. In private, she coped in various ways. She spent a lot of time away from the White House, traveling, staying at their house in Virginia, going on trips with friends. She had her own close friendships, including some speculation about whether she had her own affairs as a kind of retaliation, though nothing was ever confirmed. She focused on raising their children, Caroline and John Jr., trying to give them some normalcy despite living in the White House. And then JFK was assassinated in November 1963, and everything changed. Jackie was there in the car, holding him as he died, her pink suit covered in his blood. She maintained that composure through the funeral, through the grief, through suddenly becoming a widow at 34 with 2 young children. The image of Camelot that grew up around the Kennedy presidency was partly Jackie's creation. She gave that famous interview to Life magazine where she compared Jack's presidency to King Arthur's Camelot, creating this myth of a golden age of hope and youth and possibility that was tragically cut short. She shaped how he would be remembered, emphasizing his vision and leadership and idealism while the affairs and the recklessness faded into footnotes. But the affairs didn't stay secret forever. Books started coming out in the 1970s and 80s revealing JFK's infidelities. Women started going public with their stories. The perfect Camelot image started to crack. And Jackie, who lived until 1994, had to watch as her carefully constructed myth of her husband's presidency got dismantled by revelation after revelation about his personal life. She never publicly spoke about the affairs. She never confirmed or denied any of the specific allegations. She maintained her dignity to the end. She remarried in 1968 to Aristotle Onassis, a Greek shipping magnate, which scandalized a lot of people who thought she was betraying JFK's memory. But Jackie was done living her life for other people's expectations. She was wealthy, independent, and if she wanted to marry a rich Greek businessman and live on a private island, that was her business. She eventually returned to the United States and worked as an editor in New York, living a relatively quiet life until she died of cancer in 1994. She's remembered as an icon, but also as someone who endured a lot of private pain behind the public image. The perfect political wife who knew her husband was betraying her constantly and chose to maintain appearances because that's what was expected. Nixon's oddness, Ford's stability, and Carter's lust in his heart. Now let's shift gears and talk about Richard Nixon, because after the Kennedy years of constant affairs and reckless behavior, Nixon is almost refreshingly boring in his personal life. Almost. Nixon was deeply weird in many ways, but sexual scandal was not one of them. Nixon married Pat Ryan in 1940, and by all accounts, he was completely faithful to her throughout their marriage. Pat was a teacher when they met, smart and capable, and she became a dutiful political wife who supported his career even though she apparently hated politics and the scrutiny that came with it. She once said that she would have preferred a private life, but she'd married Dick Nixon, so that wasn't an option. The Nixons' marriage was functional but not particularly warm, at least from what we can observe from the outside. They were formal with each other, even in private according to some accounts. Nixon called her Pat or Buddy, but they weren't physically affectionate in public. They rarely held hands, rarely touched. Some people who knew them said they seemed more like business partners than romantic partners. But Nixon was loyal to her, which given the Kennedy precedent was something. He didn't have affairs. He didn't chase women. He was too paranoid, too awkward, too consumed with politics and grudges to have much interest in romance or sex. His obsessions were power and revenge, not women. There were attempts by his political enemies to create sex scandals around Nixon, but they never went anywhere because there was nothing there. Someone started a rumor that he'd had an affair with a Chinese woman during a diplomatic trip, completely fabricated. Someone else suggested he had a mistress stashed away somewhere, also made up. The man was many terrible things. Vindictive, paranoid, corrupt, willing to break the law to maintain power, but unfaithful husband wasn't one of them. Pat Nixon stood by him through everything. Through his vice presidency under Eisenhower, through his loss to JFK in 1960, through his political comeback and election in 1968, through the Vietnam War protests, through Watergate. She was there at the end when he resigned in disgrace in 1974, leaving the White House for the last time. She stood beside him, looking exhausted and sad, as they boarded the helicopter. She died in 1993, and Nixon died less than a year later. By the end, after all the scandal and disgrace, they at least had each other. It's not a romantic story, but it's a stable one, which is more than a lot of presidents could claim. Gerald Ford, who became president after Nixon resigned, was similarly boring in the best possible way. Ford married Betty Bloomer in 1948, and they stayed happily married until his death in 2006. Betty was smart, outspoken, and refreshingly honest. She talked openly about her struggles with alcoholism and prescription drug addiction. She advocated for breast cancer awareness after her own diagnosis. She supported the Equal Rights Amendment and women's rights, sometimes taking positions that were more liberal than her husband's. There were no affairs, no scandals, no illegitimate children. The Fords were just a functional married couple who happened to live in the White House for a couple of years. After Ford lost the 1976 election, they retired to California and lived quietly. Betty founded the Betty Ford Center for Substance Abuse Treatment. Gerald played golf. They were grandparents. It was all very normal and healthy, which almost seems bizarre after the dysfunction of previous administrations. Then we get to Jimmy Carter, who is also remarkably scandal-free, but who gave us one of the most memorable political quotes about infidelity ever. Carter married Rosalind Smith in 1946, and they're still married today, which is the longest presidential marriage in American history. They've been together for over 75 years. They're in their 90s now, still married, living in Plains, Georgia. But during the 1976 campaign, Carter gave an interview to Playboy magazine, which was already a slightly odd choice for a deeply religious Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher. And in that interview, he said, "I've looked on a lot of women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times." This was a bizarre thing to admit publicly. He was essentially confessing to thought crimes, to having sexual thoughts about women who weren't his wife, which is completely normal human behavior but not something presidential candidates usually announce in national magazines. The quote became instantly famous. People mocked him for it. His opponents used it against him. It became a cultural punchline. But here's the thing. Carter was being honest in a way that politicians rarely are. He was acknowledging that he had normal human desires and that he considered even lustful thoughts to be a form of infidelity according to his religious beliefs. He was trying to relate to ordinary people, to admit to temptation while also making clear that he'd never acted on it, that he'd been faithful to Rosalind in deed even if not always in thought. It was awkward and oversharing and politically unwise, but it was genuine. And Carter never had any actual affairs or scandals. He and Rosalind worked closely together during his presidency. She sat in on cabinet meetings. She was his most trusted advisor. After they left the White House, they built houses for Habitat for Humanity together. They wrote books together. They're still partners in every sense of the word. So the 1970s gave us 3 presidents in a row, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, who were all faithful to their wives. After the chaos of the Kennedy years and the Johnson years, this was a relatively calm period for presidential sexual behavior. It wouldn't last. Ronald Reagan married twice. His first marriage to actress Jane Wyman ended in divorce in 1949, which made him the first divorced president when he was elected in 1980. The divorce was apparently Wyman's idea. She said Reagan was too interested in politics and she was tired of hearing about it. Fair enough, honestly. Reagan then married Nancy Davis in 1952, and they were absolutely devoted to each other for the rest of his life. Nancy was protective of Ron to an almost obsessive degree. She controlled access to him, influenced his decisions, consulted astrologers to help plan his schedule, and generally acted as his fierce guardian. Some people found her controlling. Others saw her as a loving wife protecting her husband. There were no affairs during the Reagan marriage, though there was one weird situation with an actress named Celine Walters who claimed decades later that Reagan had forced himself on her sexually back in the 1950s, before he married Nancy. She said he'd taken her back to his apartment and assaulted her. Reagan was dead by the time she made these allegations, so he couldn't respond. There was no way to verify or disprove her story. It remains one of those historical question marks. But during his presidency and his marriage to Nancy, Reagan was by all accounts faithful. Nancy was the love of his life. When he developed Alzheimer's disease in his later years, she cared for him devotedly until he died in 2004. She survived him by 12 years, dying in 2016, and she never really recovered from losing him. Their love story was real, whatever else you might think about Reagan's politics or presidency. George H.W. Bush was another faithful husband. He married Barbara Pierce in 1945, and they were married for 73 years until Barbara's death in 2018. Bush died just 7 months later. They raised 6 children together, one of whom became president himself. another who became governor of Florida. They were partners, friends, occasionally bickered in public in that comfortable way long-married couples do. There was a weird rumor that circulated for years about Bush having an affair with his assistant, Jennifer Fitzgerald, but it was never substantiated. Bush denied it. Fitzgerald denied it. There was no evidence beyond gossip. It seems to have been one of those Washington rumors that takes on a life of its own without any real basis. So Bush Sr. was another faithful husband, continuing this surprising streak of presidential marital fidelity through the 1980s and early 90s. The White House was remarkably scandal-free during these years, at least when it came to presidential affairs. But that was about to change dramatically. Now we arrive at Bill Clinton, and oh boy, do we need to talk about Bill Clinton. Clinton's infidelities were so numerous and so public that they defined his presidency in many ways. He was nearly removed from office because of them. His wife's political career was shaped by them. The entire country had to hear details about presidential sexual behavior that no one wanted to know. Clinton married Hillary Rodham in 1975. Hillary was a Yale law graduate, brilliant, ambitious, politically engaged. They were both young lawyers with big political aspirations. Hillary was arguably more naturally talented as a political thinker than Bill was, but Bill had the charisma and the retail political skills that Hillary lacked. They were a team, but Bill Clinton had been unfaithful basically from the beginning of their relationship. There were rumors about affairs when he was governor of Arkansas. Multiple women came forward over the years claiming to have had relationships with him. Hillary knew about at least some of this. She chose to stay partly because she loved him, partly because she was invested in their political partnership, partly because leaving would have ended both of their political careers. When Clinton ran for president in 1992, the affair rumors intensified. Jennifer Flowers, a woman who claimed to have had a 12-year affair with Clinton, sold her story to a tabloid. The Clinton campaign went into damage control mode. Bill and Hillary appeared together on 60 Minutes, sitting side by side, Hillary declaring that she wasn't some little woman standing by her man like Tammy Wynette, but that she loved Bill and they were working through their problems. It worked. Clinton won the presidency, but the affairs didn't stop. During his time in the White House, Clinton had an affair with Monica Lewinsky, a young White House intern. She was 22 when it started. He was 49 and the President of the United States. The power imbalance was enormous, though Lewinsky has said in recent years that she participated willingly and doesn't see herself as a victim. Clinton, impeachment, and the modern era of scandal. The Clinton-Lewinsky affair lasted from 1995 to 1997, on and off. They would meet in private areas of the White House, the Oval Office, a small study off the Oval Office hallways. There were phone calls. There were gifts exchanged. It was reckless and stupid, and Clinton apparently couldn't help himself. Here he was the most powerful man in the world, and he was sneaking around with an intern like a teenager who couldn't control his impulses. The affair might have stayed secret, except that Lewinsky confided in a coworker, Linda Tripp, who secretly recorded their phone conversations. Tripp then gave those recordings to Kenneth Starr, the independent counsel who was already investigating Clinton for various other things. Suddenly, the affair became part of a federal investigation. In January 1998, the story broke publicly. The Washington Post reported that Starr was investigating whether Clinton had had a sexual relationship with a White House intern and whether he'd encouraged her to lie about it under oath. Clinton went on television and gave that famous denial. "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky," except he had. And now he'd lied about it on national television. The scandal consumed the country for months. Every detail of the affair came out in the Starr report, which was released to the public and contained explicit descriptions of their sexual encounters. People could read exactly what the president had done with Monica Lewinsky in the Oval Office. It was humiliating for everyone involved, for Clinton, for Lewinsky, for Hillary, for the country. Monica Lewinsky was destroyed by the scandal. She was vilified, slut-shamed, turned into a punchline. She was 24 years old and suddenly the most famous woman in America for all the wrong reasons. Her life was dissected. Her reputation was ruined. She couldn't find work. She was followed by photographers everywhere. Late-night comedians made jokes about her every night. The cruelty was relentless. Clinton eventually admitted to the affair. He went on television in August 1998 and said he'd had inappropriate intimate contact with Lewinsky. He apologized to his family and to the country, but he also seemed angry and defensive, which didn't help his case. Hillary was furious, humiliated, devastated, but she stood by him publicly. She had to. Her own political future was tied to his. If she left him, it would be the biggest story in the world and would overshadow everything else. So she stayed and she defended him and she dealt with her pain in private. Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. He was only the second president ever to be impeached after Andrew Johnson. The Senate trial happened in early 1999. Clinton was acquitted. The Senate didn't have the two-thirds majority needed to remove him from office. He finished his term, left office in January 2001 with decent approval ratings despite everything, and went on to become an elder statesman. But the scandal had lasting effects. It certainly affected Hillary's career. When she ran for Senate in New York in 2000, people were sympathetic to her partly because of what she'd endured. The wronged wife who had stayed dignified through a humiliating scandal. She won that Senate race, and then she ran for president in 2008 and lost the Democratic nomination to Barack Obama. She ran again in 2016 and won the nomination but lost the general election to Donald Trump. And the Clinton marriage endured somehow. They're still married today. They're clearly not a traditional loving couple at this point. They seem more like business partners or political allies who share a history, but they've stayed together through everything. Whether that's because of genuine affection, political calculation, shared ambition, or just inertia at this point, only they know. Monica Lewinsky, for her part, disappeared from public life for years. She eventually reemerged and has become an anti-bullying advocate, speaking about her experience and about internet shaming. She's written about how the affair was consensual, but that she now understands the power imbalance made it inappropriate regardless of her feelings at the time. She's reclaimed her narrative and her dignity, which is admirable given what she went through. Bill Clinton has had to answer for his behavior repeatedly over the years. In the Me Too era, people have re-examined his conduct and found it wanting. The affair with Lewinsky was inappropriate because of the power differential. The other women who accused him of harassment or assault deserve to be believed. His treatment of women throughout his career was predatory, and the fact that he got away with it for so long is a testament to how much power protects men from consequences. But beyond Lewinsky, there were other women. Paula Jones accused Clinton of sexual harassment when he was governor of Arkansas, claiming he'd exposed himself to her in a hotel room and propositioned her. The case eventually settled out of court. Kathleen Wiley claimed Clinton groped her in the White House. Juanita Broaddrick accused him of rape, saying he'd assaulted her in a hotel room in 1978. Clinton denied all of these allegations, and none of them were proven in court, but the pattern is troubling. So Bill Clinton's legacy is forever tainted by his personal behavior. He was a talented politician and in many ways a successful president, but he was also a serial adulterer and sexual harasser who used his power to prey on women and then lied about it repeatedly. And his wife paid a huge personal and political price for his behavior while he got to remain beloved by many people despite everything. Now let's talk about George W. Bush, because after the Clinton scandals, Bush represented a return to traditional family values, at least in his campaign messaging. Bush married Laura Welch in 1977, just 3 months after they met. Laura was a librarian and teacher, quiet and dignified, the opposite of the political spotlight seeker. They had twin daughters, Barbara and Jenna, and by all accounts have a strong, stable marriage. There were no affairs, no scandals, no illegitimate children. The Bushes were and are a normal married couple. Bush had struggled with alcohol in his younger years and quit drinking entirely in his 40s. Laura was apparently instrumental in that decision, giving him an ultimatum about his drinking. He credits her with saving his life in many ways. The Bush marriage was so boring, in the best sense, that there's really nothing to say about it. They were faithful to each other. They raised their daughters. They supported each other through the presidency and through the aftermath. When Bush left office as one of the most unpopular presidents in modern history, Laura was still there. They retired to Texas and have lived quietly, painting and writing books and appearing occasionally for important events. It's all very wholesome. Barack Obama is similarly scandal-free when it comes to his marriage. Obama married Michelle Robinson in 1992, and they have what appears to be a genuinely loving, equal partnership. They met when they were both lawyers in Chicago. Michelle was actually Barack's mentor at the law firm where they both worked. She was smart, accomplished, skeptical about his political ambitions at first. They have 2 daughters, Malia and Sasha, and the Obamas worked hard to give them as normal a childhood as possible despite living in the White House. Michelle became an influential First Lady, focusing on childhood obesity, military families, and education. She was more popular than Barack for much of his presidency, which he joked about regularly. There were no affairs, no scandals. The worst thing conservatives could come up with was criticizing Michelle's bare arms in official photos, which says more about them than about her. Obama clearly adores his wife. They're affectionate in public, they joke together, they support each other. After leaving the White House, they signed a massive deal with Netflix, wrote best-selling memoirs, and have maintained their reputation as relationship goals. The Obama marriage is so healthy that it's almost suspicious by presidential standards, but there's no evidence of anything untoward. They're just 2 people who met, fell in love, built a life together, raised kids, navigated the presidency, and came out the other side still liking each other. Revolutionary, apparently. And then we get to Donald Trump, and oh boy, where do we even start? Trump has been married 3 times, has had numerous affairs, has been accused of sexual assault and harassment by multiple women, paid hush money to cover up affairs, and generally conducted his personal life like a reality TV show, which makes sense given that he literally starred in a reality TV show. Trump's first marriage was to Ivana Zelnikova, a Czech model and athlete, in 1977. They had 3 children together, Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric. The marriage ended in a very public, very messy divorce in 1992 after Trump had an affair with Marla Maples, who would become his second wife. The affair with Marla Maples was tabloid gold. It played out in the New York newspapers with Ivana and Marla both making statements, Trump clearly enjoying the attention. There was a famous confrontation on a ski slope in Aspen where Ivana and Marla reportedly got into an argument, with Marla allegedly saying, "I love your husband. Do you?" It was trashy and public, and Trump seemed to revel in it. Trump married Marla Maples in 1993, 2 months after she gave birth to their daughter Tiffany. So Tiffany was conceived while Trump was still married to Ivana, though separated. The marriage to Marla lasted 6 years and ended in divorce in 1999. Trump had apparently already moved on and was dating other women before the divorce was finalized. In 2005, Trump married Melania Naus, a Slovenian model who was 24 years younger than him. They had a son, Baron, in 2006. Melania has been a largely silent presence as First Lady and as Trump's wife, speaking rarely, maintaining an impassive expression, and generally seeming like she'd rather be anywhere else. And then there are the affairs during the marriage to Melania. Trump allegedly had affairs with adult film actress Stormy Daniels and with Playboy model Karen McDougal in 2006, just after Barron was born. Both women eventually went public with their stories. Trump denied the affairs, but his lawyer Michael Cohen paid Stormy Daniels $130,000 in hush money during the 2016 campaign to keep her quiet. Cohen went to prison partly for campaign finance violations related to that payment. The whole thing was sordid. Stormy Daniels gave interviews describing the affair in detail. Karen McDougal sold her story. Trump's lawyer went to prison. Melania stayed silent. The evangelical Christians who supported Trump made endless excuses for his behavior or simply didn't care. It was all very 2016. And beyond those affairs, there have been accusations from numerous women about Trump's behavior over the decades. Sexual harassment, sexual assault, inappropriate touching, walking into dressing rooms while young women were changing at beauty pageants he owned. The Access Hollywood tape where he talked about grabbing women by their genitals. Jean Carroll's accusation that he raped her in a department store dressing room in the 1990s, which resulted in a civil trial that found him liable for sexual abuse. Trump's scandals, Biden's grief, and the evolution of presidential infidelity. Trump's pattern of behavior with women is extensive and well documented. Over 24 women have accused him of sexual misconduct over the years, ranging from unwanted kissing and groping to rape. Trump has denied all of these allegations, usually by attacking the women making them, calling them liars, suggesting they weren't attractive enough for him to assault, which is its own kind of horrifying response. The Jean Carroll case is particularly notable because it actually went to trial. Carroll accused Trump of raping her in a Bergdorf Goodman dressing room in the mid-1990s. Trump denied even knowing her, despite there being a photograph of them together. He called her a liar and continued to defame her even after she sued him. In 2023, a jury found Trump liable for sexual abuse and defamation and awarded Carroll $5 million. Then Trump defamed her again, and another jury awarded her an additional $83 million in damages. So that's the former president found liable in civil court for sexual abuse. Trump's marriages and affairs represent a different kind of presidential scandal than what we've talked about before. With Kennedy or Clinton, there was at least some attempt at discretion, some embarrassment when caught, some acknowledgement that the behavior was wrong. Trump has no such shame. He's been open about his affairs, bragged about his sexual conquests, rated women's attractiveness publicly, made crude sexual comments throughout his life. His base doesn't seem to care, which says something about how much political tribalism has replaced actual values. Melania has stayed with him through all of this, though she's often looked miserable doing so. She didn't move to Washington immediately when Trump became president, staying in New York for several months supposedly so Barron could finish the school year. She's swatted his hand away when he's tried to hold hers in public. She's worn clothes with messages that seem to be commentary on her situation, like that, "I really don't care. Do you?" jacket. She seems trapped in a marriage she can't or won't leave, maintaining appearances while clearly unhappy. Their relationship is transactional in a way that's obvious to everyone. She gets wealth and status. He gets a beautiful wife who photographs well and makes him look successful. It's not a partnership based on love or respect or shared values. It's a contract, and both parties seem to be fulfilling their obligations without any pretense of actual affection. Now let's talk about Joe Biden, because Biden represents yet another model of presidential marriage, one shaped by tragedy and loss rather than by scandal. Biden married Nylia Hunter in 1966, and they had 3 children together: Beau, Hunter, and Naomi. By all accounts, it was a happy marriage. Nylia was actively involved in Biden's first Senate campaign in 1972, which he won at age 29, becoming one of the youngest senators ever elected. But just weeks after Biden won that election, in December 1972, Nylia and their 1-year-old daughter Naomi were killed in a car accident. Their 2 sons, Beau and Hunter, were injured but survived. Biden was devastated. He was sworn into the Senate at his son's hospital bedside because he couldn't leave them. He seriously considered not taking the seat at all, just giving up politics entirely to focus on his boys. He commuted from Delaware to Washington every day for years so he could be home with his sons at night. He was a single father, a grieving widower, trying to do his job while raising 2 traumatized young boys. It shaped everything about who he became as a person and as a politician. In 1977, Biden met Jill Jacobs, who was a teacher. They were introduced by Joe's brother on a blind date. They married in 1977, and Jill became a stepmother to Beau and Hunter. They had a daughter together, Ashley, born in 1981. By all accounts, it's been a strong, loving marriage. Jill has her own career. She continued teaching even as second lady and now as first lady, which is unusual. She's her own person, not just a political wife. There have been no affairs, no scandals in Biden's personal life. The tragedies continued, though. Beau Biden, who had become Attorney General of Delaware and seemed destined for a major political career of his own, died of brain cancer in 2015. He was only 46. Biden was devastated again, losing his son. He decided not to run for president in 2016 partly because of his grief over Beau's death. Biden's other son, Hunter, has struggled with addiction and has been involved in various scandals, though those are Hunter's issues, not Joe's marital infidelity. The Biden marriage itself is scandal-free. Joe clearly adores Jill. He talks about her constantly, looks to her for support, values her opinion. She's protective of him, especially now that he's elderly and showing signs of age. They're partners in the fullest sense. So we've gone from the founding fathers who kept enslaved mistresses and fathered secret children, to the 19th century presidents with their hidden affairs and illegitimate children they refused to acknowledge, to the 20th century presidents who ranged from serial philanderers to devoted husbands, to the modern era where some presidents maintain stable marriages while others engage in increasingly public scandals that no longer seem to damage them politically the way they once did. What's interesting is how the consequences for presidential infidelity have changed over time. Thomas Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings was whispered about, but didn't prevent him from being reelected or from maintaining his historical reputation for generations. Grover Cleveland's illegitimate child was a campaign issue, but he won anyway. Warren Harding's affairs stayed mostly secret until after his death. Franklin Roosevelt's affairs were known to insiders but not reported by the press. Kennedy's affairs were an open secret in Washington, but the media didn't report them, and he remained popular and became a martyr after his assassination. Clinton's affairs were investigated by Congress and he was impeached, but he survived politically and left office with decent approval ratings. Trump's affairs and the accusations against him didn't prevent him from being elected, and his supporters simply didn't care or actively defended him. The evolution seems to be toward more public knowledge of presidential behavior but less political consequence for it, at least for some presidents. The press no longer maintains the same code of silence about presidents' personal lives. Everything comes out eventually, but voters seem to have become either more forgiving or more cynical, either deciding that personal behavior doesn't matter as long as they agree with the politics, or just accepting that powerful men often behave badly and there's nothing to be done about it. The women involved in these scandals have fared differently depending on the era. Sally Hemings had no voice in how her story was told for 200 years. Maria Halpin was institutionalized and had her child taken away. Lucy Mercer and Missy Lujan stayed silent their entire lives. Monica Lewinsky was destroyed by the media and took years to recover. Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal went public and were attacked viciously, but at least got to tell their own stories. The wives have had varied responses too. Martha Jefferson never knew about Sally Hemings, or at least we have no record of her knowing. Rachel Jackson died believing her honor had been defended by her husband. Eleanor Roosevelt created her own independent life and legacy. Jackie Kennedy shaped the narrative of Camelot while knowing the truth behind it. Hillary Clinton became a political figure in her own right partly because of how she handled her husband's infidelities. Melania Trump has maintained a cold, distant presence that speaks volumes without saying anything. What's clear is that presidential infidelity is as old as the presidency itself. It's not a modern phenomenon brought on by social decay or changing values. The founding fathers were messy in their personal lives. 19th century presidents had affairs and secret children. 20th century presidents ranged from faithfully devoted to compulsively unfaithful. The specific circumstances and consequences have varied, but the basic pattern has remained consistent. Power attracts certain types of people. People who are ambitious, driven, charismatic, willing to make personal sacrifices to achieve their goals. Those same traits can make someone attractive as a leader and also make them prone to infidelity. The narcissism required to believe you should be president might be related to the narcissism that makes you believe normal rules don't apply to you in your personal life. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe presidents are just people, and people are complicated and flawed. Some people are faithful to their partners their whole lives. Some people make mistakes and regret them. Some people are serial cheaters who never feel genuine remorse. Presidents aren't any different from anyone else in that regard. They just have more power, more access, more opportunity, and more spotlight when things go wrong. The institution of the presidency hasn't been destroyed by these scandals, though they've certainly damaged individual presidencies and shaped individual legacies. Jefferson is still on Mount Rushmore despite Sally Hemings. Kennedy is still remembered fondly despite being reckless with national security because he couldn't stop having affairs. Clinton's economic record is still praised even though he was impeached for lying about an affair with an intern. Patterns, power, and the price of scandal. So what does all of this tell us about the American presidency and about American culture more broadly? Well, for one thing, it tells us that we've always had a complicated relationship with our leaders' personal lives. We want them to be moral exemplars, symbols of virtue and family values, but we also elect deeply flawed people over and over again. We express shock and outrage when their flaws are revealed, but then we often forgive them or at least move on. There's also a clear gender component to all of this. Every single one of these scandals involves a male president and female partners, mistresses, or victims. We haven't had a female president yet, so we don't know how her personal life would be scrutinized or what scandals might emerge, but it's safe to say the standards would be different. Women in politics are held to much higher standards for their personal behavior than men are. A female politician with Trump's history of affairs and accusations would never have been taken seriously as a candidate. And the women involved in these presidential scandals have borne enormous costs. Sally Hemings was enslaved and had no control over her own life or body. Maria Halpin was institutionalized and lost her child. The women Kennedy was involved with had to maintain silence for decades. Monica Lewinsky's life was destroyed when she was barely out of college. The women who accused Trump of assault were attacked and threatened. Meanwhile, the men involved, the presidents themselves, generally continued their careers with minimal lasting damage. There's something deeply unfair about that imbalance, but it reflects broader social patterns. Women are judged more harshly for sexual behavior. Women who have affairs with powerful men are called homewreckers and sluts, while the men are called rogues or players, terms that carry far less stigma. Women who accuse powerful men of assault are questioned and doubted, while the men are given the benefit of the doubt. The evolution of media coverage has changed the dynamics of presidential scandals significantly. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the press knew about affairs but generally didn't report them. There was a sense that a president's private life was private as long as it didn't affect his public duties. Journalists who covered FDR never mentioned his relationship with Missy Lujan or his inability to walk without assistance. It just wasn't considered relevant or appropriate to report. That began to change in the 1960s and 70s with the rise of investigative journalism and a more skeptical press corps. Watergate taught journalists that presidents lie and cover things up, so nothing should be taken at face value. By the 1980s and 90s, presidential candidates' personal lives were considered fair game. Gary Hart's presidential campaign imploded in 1987 when the Miami Herald staked out his townhouse and caught him with a woman who wasn't his wife on a boat called Monkey Business. Just absolutely terrible judgment all around. The internet and social media have accelerated this trend even further. Nothing stays secret anymore. Photos and videos can be shared instantly. Women who might have stayed silent in previous eras can now tell their stories directly to the public without needing traditional media gatekeepers. The Me Too movement empowered women to speak up about sexual harassment and assault, leading to reckonings for powerful men across all industries, including politics. But interestingly, this hasn't necessarily led to better behavior from presidents or to higher standards for who gets elected. Trump was elected despite the Access Hollywood tape, despite multiple accusations, despite his own public statements about his treatment of women. A significant portion of the electorate simply didn't care or actively admired his defiance of conventional morality. The same evangelicals who had condemned Clinton's affair with Lewinsky gave Trump a pass on everything, suggesting that their outrage had been more about politics than actual moral standards all along. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Presidential scandals often tell us more about ourselves as a society than they do about the individuals involved. What we choose to be outraged about, who we choose to forgive, which behaviors we consider disqualifying and which we dismiss as irrelevant. These choices reveal our actual values as opposed to our stated ones. We say we value family and fidelity and respect for women, but we've elected men who clearly don't embody those values. We say character matters, but we regularly overlook character flaws if we like someone's politics. We say we want honesty and transparency, but we also seem to prefer the polite fiction that our leaders are better than they are. Different eras have handled this cognitive dissonance differently. In earlier periods, the solution was simply not to talk about it. Affairs happened, everyone in elite circles knew about them, but they weren't discussed publicly. There was a conspiracy of silence that protected powerful men and allowed them to maintain public reputations that didn't match their private behavior. The Clinton era represented a shift where everything became public, every detail was discussed explicitly, but the political consequences were mixed. Clinton was impeached but not removed. His approval ratings actually went up during the scandal, partly because people thought the investigation was politically motivated and excessive. The public was simultaneously disgusted by his behavior and unwilling to see him removed from office for it. The Trump era seems to represent yet another shift, where scandals are so constant and overwhelming that they lose their power to shock. When there's a new accusation or revelation every week, when the president himself openly lies and admits to behavior that would have ended any previous presidency, people become numb to it. The scandals become background noise rather than defining moments. This normalization of scandal is perhaps more troubling than the scandals themselves. If nothing a president does in their personal life matters anymore, if accusations of assault and affairs and hush money payments don't disqualify someone from office, then what does? If the character doesn't matter, what are we actually voting for? Just policy positions and tribal loyalty? But maybe that's always what politics has been about, and we're just being more honest about it now. Maybe voters have always cared more about whether a president's policies benefit them than about whether he's faithful to his wife. Maybe the moral outrage has always been performative, a way to attack political opponents rather than a genuine concern about ethics and values. Still, there's something sad about the progression we've traced tonight. From Jefferson, who at least had the decency to never publicly discuss his relationship with Sally Hemings, to Kennedy, who was reckless but discreet, to Clinton, who was caught and showed some shame, to Trump, who openly brags and shows no remorse whatsoever. The trajectory seems to be toward less accountability, less shame, less sense that personal behavior matters at all. And what about the impact on the families involved? The children of these presidents grew up knowing or eventually learning that their fathers were unfaithful, that their mothers were humiliated publicly, that their family dynamics were discussed in newspapers and history books. How do you process being Sally Hemings' child, knowing your father owned your mother? How do you cope being one of Kennedy's kids, hearing decades of affairs detailed in books and documentaries? How do you deal with being Chelsea Clinton, watching your mother defend your father through a national humiliation? How do you function as Baron Trump, with your father's behavior and your mother's misery playing out in public constantly? These children didn't choose to be part of presidential families. They didn't choose to have their family dysfunction become historical record. But they've had to live with the consequences of their father's choices and their parents' decisions to stay together or split apart. Some of them have thrived despite this. Some have struggled. All of them have had to develop a thick skin and a complicated relationship with their family legacy. The wives and partners deserve consideration too. These women, whether they were enslaved like Sally Hemings, wronged like Maria Halpin, stoic like Eleanor Roosevelt, image-conscious like Jackie Kennedy, politically ambitious like Hillary Clinton, or coldly detached like Melania Trump, all had to navigate impossible situations. Stay or leave, defend or denounce, speak or stay silent. There were no good options, just different forms of damage control and self-preservation. Some of them used their position to build their own legacies independent of their husband's scandals. Eleanor Roosevelt became a champion of human rights. Betty Ford founded a treatment center. Hillary Clinton became a senator and secretary of state and presidential candidate. Michelle Obama became a best-selling author and cultural icon. They took the platform that came with being First Lady and used it for their own purposes, refusing to be defined solely by their relationships to their husbands. Others maintained dignity through silence and service, focusing on traditional First Lady roles and charitable work, avoiding the spotlight as much as possible. Lady Bird Johnson beautified America and stayed gracious through her husband's infidelities. Barbara Bush raised a family and supported literacy programs and never publicly complained about the life she'd chosen. Laura Bush promoted education and maintained her privacy and seemed content with a supporting role. And some, like Melania Trump, seemed to simply endure, doing the minimum required of them, maintaining appearances, waiting for it to be over. She didn't ask for any of this, having married a wealthy businessman decades older than her, only to find herself thrust into politics and public scrutiny that she clearly despises. You can see it in her face, in her body language, in her rare public statements. She's trapped and she knows it and everyone knows it, but she stays anyway, for reasons only she fully understands. What's the takeaway from all of this? Is there a lesson in this long catalog of presidential infidelity and scandal? Maybe it's that power really does corrupt, or at least power attracts people who are already comfortable bending rules and ignoring consequences. Maybe it's that we should stop being surprised when powerful people behave badly, since the historical record shows this is entirely normal and predictable. Or maybe the lesson is that we need to reconsider what we actually care about when we elect presidents. Do we care about their personal morality and how they treat the people closest to them? Or do we only care about their policy positions and their political effectiveness? Can we separate the personal from the political? Or is character actually destiny, and a man who cheats on his wife is likely to cheat the country too? Different people will answer these questions differently based on their own values and political allegiances. Some people genuinely believe personal behavior reveals character and character matters for leadership. Other people genuinely believe that personal behavior is irrelevant as long as the policy outcomes are good. Both positions are internally consistent, even if they're incompatible with each other. What seems clear is that American culture hasn't reached consensus on these questions, and maybe never will. We're going to keep electing flawed people and then being shocked when their flaws are revealed. We're going to keep having national conversations about whether personal scandals should end political careers. We're going to keep seeing different standards applied to different people based on partisan loyalty rather than consistent principles. Reflections, legacies, and the long view of presidential behavior. So here we are, having traced presidential infidelity from the founding of the Republic through to the present day, and what we've discovered is that presidents are just people. Complicated, flawed, sometimes terrible people who happen to have achieved the highest office in the land. They're capable of leading nations through wars and depressions while simultaneously making disastrous personal choices. They can inspire millions with their vision for the country while treating the people closest to them with contempt or cruelty. The two things coexist uncomfortably throughout American history. It's worth thinking about what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. Thomas Jefferson is still celebrated as a founding father, author of the Declaration of Independence, champion of democracy. The Sally Hemings relationship is now acknowledged by most historians, but it hasn't fundamentally changed how Jefferson is viewed in the popular imagination. He's still on the nickel. Monticello is still a tourist destination. His ideas about liberty and self-governance are still taught in schools, even though he held his own children in bondage. John F. Kennedy remains one of the most beloved presidents in American history, despite everything we now know about his reckless behavior. The image of Camelot persists. People still quote his inaugural address. His assassination is still seen as a national tragedy. The affairs are acknowledged but treated as a kind of character flaw that doesn't diminish his historical importance. He was handsome and charismatic and died young, and apparently that's enough to secure a legacy that transcends personal failing. Bill Clinton's legacy is more mixed. He's remembered for the strong economy of the 1990s, for his political skills, for being the first Democratic president re-elected since FDR. But he's also forever associated with the Lewinsky scandal and impeachment. It's impossible to mention Clinton without someone bringing up Monica Lewinsky. The scandal has become inseparable from his presidency in a way that Kennedy's affairs never became for him. And Trump's legacy is still being written, but it's clear that his personal behavior, his treatment of women, the numerous accusations against him, the hush money payments, all of this will be central to how he's remembered. Whether that matters to his supporters or to history's judgment remains to be seen. He's the first president to be impeached twice, the first to be criminally indicted after leaving office, and yet he ran for president again and might even win. So clearly the normal rules of political consequences don't apply anymore, if they ever really did. What about the women whose lives intersected with these powerful men? History has not been kind to most of them. Sally Hemings was barely mentioned in history books for 2 centuries. Maria Halpin was a footnote. Lucy Mercer and Missy Lujan were airbrushed out of the FDR story for decades. Marilyn Monroe became more famous for her death and her affairs than for her acting talent. Monica Lewinsky became a punchline. These women's identities were reduced to their relationships with presidents, their own stories subsumed into the narrative of male power. Only in recent years has there been an effort to recover these women's experiences, to tell their stories on their own terms rather than just as accessories to presidential biography. Sally Hemings is now understood as a person, not just Jefferson's mistress, someone who navigated an impossible situation with whatever agency she could maintain. Monica Lewinsky has reclaimed her narrative and become an advocate. Even Marilyn Monroe is being reassessed, with recent books and documentaries focusing on her talent and her struggles rather than just her sex symbol status and her death. This shift in how we tell these stories reflects broader cultural changes about gender, power, and consent. We're more willing now to acknowledge that relationships involving significant power imbalances can't truly be consensual, even if both parties claim they are. We're more willing to believe women who come forward with accusations. We're more willing to hold powerful men accountable, though clearly not willing enough since many of them continue to face no real consequences. The question of what actually constitutes accountability in these cases is complicated. Legal consequences, political consequences, historical judgment, public shame? For most of the presidents we've discussed tonight, the answer is some combination of these or none at all. Jefferson faced some contemporary criticism but remained politically successful. Cleveland was embarrassed but won the presidency anyway. Harding's affairs were fully revealed only after his death. Kennedy's affairs were protected by the press and by social norms. Clinton was impeached but acquitted and left office popular. Trump has faced civil judgments but remains politically viable. So if powerful men generally don't face serious consequences for their personal behavior, what's the deterrent? What stops presidents from behaving badly? The answer seems to be not much. Some presidents are faithful because of personal values, because they genuinely love their spouses, because their moral or religious beliefs guide their behavior. Others are unfaithful because power provides opportunity, because they don't believe normal rules apply to them. This brings us back to the fundamental question of what we actually want from presidents. Do we want them to be moral exemplars, or do we just want them to be effective leaders? Can someone be an effective leader while being a terrible spouse? The historical evidence suggests yes, absolutely. Some of the most consequential presidents, Jefferson, FDR, Kennedy, Clinton, were also among the most unfaithful. Their personal failures didn't prevent them from achieving significant political accomplishments. But there's also the question of what kind of society we want to be. If we signal that personal behavior doesn't matter, that powerful men can treat women however they want without real consequences, that commitment and fidelity and respect are optional for our leaders, what message does that send? Do we really want to tell young people that success and power mean you get to ignore the rules that govern everyone else? Different people will answer this question differently, and that's fine. Democracy means we get to disagree about values and priorities, but it's worth being honest about the trade-offs. If we decide personal behavior doesn't matter, we can't then be shocked when our leaders behave badly. If we decide character is destiny and personal morality is essential for leadership, we need to be consistent about applying those standards regardless of political affiliation. What we've done historically is apply inconsistent standards based on partisan loyalty and personal biases. We forgive the failings of presidents we like and condemn the failings of presidents we don't. We make excuses for our side and express outrage at the other side. We claim to have principles, but we abandon them when convenient. And maybe that's just human nature. Maybe it's unrealistic to expect people to hold their preferred candidates to the same standards they apply to opponents. Maybe tribalism is stronger than principle, always has been, always will be. But it's worth acknowledging the hypocrisy when we see it, in ourselves and in others. The presidential marriages we've discussed tonight represent a spectrum of human relationships under extraordinary pressure. Some couples, like the Carters, the Fords, the Bushes Sr., the Obamas, seem to have maintained genuine partnerships based on mutual respect and affection. Others, like the Kennedys, the Clintons, the Trumps, have maintained marriages that are clearly transactional or damaged or held together by political necessity rather than love. And some, like the Roosevelts, created entirely new models of marriage that worked for them even if they didn't look like traditional partnerships. Eleanor and Franklin maintained a political alliance and apparently genuine respect for each other's work even after romantic love had ended. They both found emotional and possibly romantic fulfillment outside the marriage while maintaining their partnership. It was unconventional, but it worked for them, more or less. The wives in these stories deserve recognition for navigating impossible situations with whatever grace they could muster. Whether they stayed or left, whether they spoke out or stayed silent, whether they built independent legacies or focused on supporting their husbands, they were dealing with circumstances most people never face. Being married to a president is hard enough without adding infidelity and scandal to the mix. And we should spare some sympathy for the current political spouses too, the ones who aren't presidents but whose personal lives are still scrutinized because of their partner's positions. Vice presidential spouses, cabinet members' spouses, prominent senators and governors' spouses, they all navigate similar pressures on a smaller scale. The spotlight isn't as intense, but the expectations are still there. The potential for scandal still exists. The need to maintain appearances still matters. As we wind down this long journey through presidential infidelity, it's worth noting that this is far from a comprehensive history. We've hit the major scandals, the well-documented affairs, the presidents whose personal lives became public knowledge. But there are undoubtedly other stories we don't know. Affairs that stayed secret, relationships that were never documented, scandals that were successfully buried. The historical record is incomplete, shaped by what people chose to write down, what documents survived, what witnesses were willing to talk about. For every affair we know about, there might be others that remain hidden. For every woman who came forward with accusations, there might be others who stayed silent out of fear or shame, or because they knew no one would believe them. So what we've discussed tonight is the visible portion of presidential infidelity, the part that made it into the historical record. The full story is probably much messier and more extensive. And that's okay. We don't need to know every detail of every president's personal life, but we should be aware that what we do know is likely just a fraction of what actually happened. Looking forward, it's unclear whether presidential scandals will continue to evolve or whether we've reached some kind of equilibrium where everything is public but nothing matters. The rise of social media and the 24-hour news cycle means that scandals develop faster and spread more widely than ever before. But they also fade faster, replaced by the next outrage, the next controversy, the next shocking revelation. Maybe future presidents will be more careful, more discreet, more aware that everything eventually comes out. Or maybe they'll be even more brazen, having watched Trump face minimal consequences for behavior that would have destroyed any previous presidency. Maybe the culture will shift back toward valuing personal morality and character. Or maybe we'll continue down the path of pure transactional politics where nothing matters except power and policy outcomes. What seems certain is that as long as there are presidents, there will be presidential scandals. Power attracts ambitious people, and ambitious people often have complicated personal lives. The specific details will vary, different affairs, different cover-ups, different consequences, but the basic pattern will likely continue. Presidents are human, humans are flawed, and those flaws tend to be magnified by power and opportunity. And that's where we'll leave things tonight. We've traced a long, winding path through American history, from Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings all the way to the modern era, examining how presidents have conducted their personal lives and how those personal choices have intersected with their public roles. We've seen patterns of behavior repeat across centuries, seen consequences vary wildly based on era and circumstance, seen women pay prices for men's choices again and again. It's been a journey through the messy, uncomfortable, often sad reality behind the mythology of the American presidency. These men we elect to lead us are just men, capable of greatness and pettiness, of inspiring vision and selfish betrayal, often simultaneously. They're neither the heroes their supporters believe them to be, nor the villains their opponents claim. They're complicated people in impossible positions, sometimes rising to the occasion and sometimes failing spectacularly. And now, hopefully, you're ready to drift off to sleep, your mind filled with the gentle chaos of presidential dysfunction, secure in the knowledge that our leaders have always been a mess and probably always will be. Nothing to worry about, just the way things have always been. Sleep well.